At Magnolia's diner in Charleston, a pregnant waitress became the target of daily mockery and cruel whispers from a group of wealthy customers who treated her like their personal entertainment. The ones insulting Maria didn't notice the quiet man in worn denim quietly sipping coffee just 3 booths away, watching every humiliating moment unfold. But Samuel Carter wasn't just another customer, he was the owner, the founder who had built this place from nothing, over 20 years. The person who signed their paychecks? For decades, he'd been cultivating a culture of respect and integrity, and this moment betrayed everything he stood for. When Tiffany Vaughn crossed the final line, calling Maria selfish and a charity case loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear, she triggered a silent fury from someone who'd spent his life defending the underdog. Sam rose from his booth with the calm authority of a man who'd finally seen enough, delivering a zero-tolerance confrontation that shattered every assumption about who held the real power in that room. It started with gossip and cruelty. It ended with a legacy-defining moment that reminded everyone, disrespect carries consequences, and sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. This is the story of how one man's quiet observation became one woman's vindication, and how the corner booth that had been a stage for cruelty became the setting for one of the most satisfying moments of justice you'll ever witness. Before we dive in, where are you watching from? Whether you're at home, at work, or somewhere in between, this story might hit closer than you expect. If you've ever felt overlooked or undervalued, what happened at this Charleston diner will speak to you. Hit like if you believe everyone deserves dignity, and subscribe for more stories where quiet strength takes the spotlight. You won't see this ending coming. The lunch rush at Magnolia's diner hit like a warm wave every day at noon, filling the Charleston establishment with the comfortable chaos of clinking plates and overlapping conversations. Steam rose from the open kitchen, carrying the scent of cornbread and collard greens, while the afternoon sun slanted through vintage windows, casting golden rectangles across worn vinyl booths. Maria Lopez moved through it all with practiced grace, her 7-month belly preceding her like a gentle announcement of life to come. She balanced 3 plates on her left arm while her right hand steadied the coffee pot, navigating between tables with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd learned to work around her changing body without complaint. "Excuse me," she said softly, sliding past a businessman engrossed in his phone, her voice carrying the faint accent of her grandmother's Puerto Rican lullabies. At the corner booth, one with the best view of the harbor, Tiffany Vaughn held court with her usual entourage. Designer handbags hung from chairbacks like expensive shields, and perfectly manicured nails tapped against imported coffee cups. Tiffany's blonde hair fell in calculated waves over her shoulders as she leaned forward, her voice carrying just loud enough to be heard at neighboring tables. "I mean, look at her," Tiffany said, not bothering to lower her voice as Maria approached with their order. "How does she even fit between the tables anymore? It's like watching a parade float try to navigate a parking lot." Her friends giggled high-practiced sounds that cut through the diner's warmth like winter wind. Maria's steps didn't falter, but something tightened around her eyes, so brief that only someone truly watching would notice. 3 booths away, Samuel Carter sat alone with his newspaper and black coffee, his weathered hands still except for the occasional turn of a page. To any observer, he was just another customer, a man in his 50s with graying temples and the kind, quiet presence that made servers comfortable but never demanded attention. His worn denim jacket and scuffed boots suggested someone who worked with his hands, maybe construction or maintenance, but Sam's eyes weren't on his paper. They tracked Maria's movement, noted the way she straightened her shoulders before approaching Tiffany's table, observed how Derek, the young busboy, paused in his work to watch with barely concealed concern. "Here you go," Maria said, setting down plates with careful precision. "The shrimp and grits for you, ma'am, and the fried green tomatoes for the table." Tiffany didn't look up from her phone. "About time. I was beginning to think you'd gotten lost on the way over here, or maybe just stuck between 2 tables. The laughter that followed was razor-sharp. Maria's hand instinctively moved to her belly, a protective gesture so unconscious it seemed like breathing. Sam watched her swallow whatever words might have risen to her lips, watched her smile remain steady even as something died behind her eyes. "Can I get you anything else?" Maria asked, her voice professionally pleasant. "Just the check," Tiffany said, finally looking up, "and maybe some tips on how to carry a tray without looking like you're about to topple over." For future reference, Derek dropped a bus tub in the kitchen, the crash echoing through the diner. Sam's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. Even the businessman at the next table glanced up from his phone, his expression uncomfortable. Maria nodded once, a movement so controlled it might have been carved from stone. "Of course, I'll be right back with that." She turned away, and Sam saw what the others missed the way. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her order pad, the careful breath she took before moving to the next table. 20 years of watching people had taught him to read the stories written in small gestures, and Maria's story was becoming harder to ignore. "Janice," The senior waitress, whose gray hair was always pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, intercepted Maria at the coffee station. At 62, she'd seen enough cruelty to recognize its many faces. "Baby girl," she said quietly, refilling Maria's coffee pot. "You don't have to take that." "It's fine," Maria replied, but her voice was slightly hoarse. "It's just words." "Words got power," Janice said, her Louisiana accent thickening with emotion, especially when they're meant to hurt. Maria's smile was tired, but genuine. "I need this job, Janice. You know that. I know you deserve better." "We all deserve better," Maria said, touching Janice's shoulder gently. "But sometimes we work with what we have." Derek appeared beside them, his young face flushed with indignation. "I heard what she said. That's not right." "Maria, someone should what?" Maria asked, not unkindly. "Tell a customer how to behave. Get us all written up, get you fired." Derek's jaw worked silently. He was 19, still carrying the weight of right and wrong without understanding the gravity of consequences. "It's just not fair." "Fair's got nothing to do with it," Janice said, but her eyes were on Maria with something that looked like heartbreak. Sam folded his newspaper and stood, leaving exact change on the table. As he walked past the coffee station, he paused, pretending to read the dessert menu posted on the wall. Derek was close enough to hear when Sam spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Has it always been like this?" Derek looked up surprised. Sam's eyes were kind but serious, and something in them made Derek answer honestly. "The last couple weeks, it's gotten worse." She never says anything back, though. Just takes it. Sam nodded once, then walked toward the exit. But he didn't leave. Instead, he stopped at the counter, exchanged a few words with the hostess, and returned to a different booth, one with a clearer view of the corner table. Maria delivered the check to Tiffany's table with the same professional grace she'd maintained all afternoon. Tiffany signed it with a flourish, leaving a tip so small it might have been an insult, then gathered her purse and stood. "Try not to knock over any customers on your way to the kitchen," she said, loud enough for half the diner to hear. "I'd hate for someone to get hurt." This time, the silence that followed was different. It stretched across the restaurant like a held breath, broken only by the soft clink of Sam setting down his coffee cup. Maria's hand found her belly again, and for a moment her careful composure cracked. Not enough for tears, but enough for Sam to see the weight she carried, not just the child growing inside her, but the accumulated burden of small cruelties, of choosing dignity over defense, of protecting her job and her future at the cost of her peace. As Tiffany and her friends swept toward the exit, Maria turned toward the kitchen, her steps careful and measured. She paused at the coffee station, one hand braced against the counter, and took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. Derek appeared at her elbow. "Maria, you okay?" She straightened, her smile returning like armor. "Always am, honey, always am." But Sam, watching from his new vantage point, saw the lie in the set of her shoulders, heard it in the careful steadiness of her voice. He'd spent 20 years building this place, watching hundreds of employees come and go, learning to read the difference between someone having a bad day and someone being slowly worn down by the weight of holding their tongue. The lunch rush was winding down, but the echo of cruelty lingered in the air like smoke. Maria continued her work, serving tables with the same gentle efficiency, but something had shifted. The cost of her silence was becoming visible, and Sam found himself thinking about the conversation he'd overheard between Derek and Janice, about fairness and dignity and the price of keeping quiet. As the afternoon sun slanted lower through the windows, casting longer shadows across the diner floor, Sam opened his newspaper again, but his eyes weren't on the headlines. They were on Maria, on the corner booth where cruelty had made itself at home. The story was just beginning, but already Sam could feel the weight of what was coming, the moment when watching would no longer be enough, when silence would demand its reckoning, and when the true measure of a person's character would be tested not by their words, but by their willingness to act when it mattered most. 2 weeks earlier, the first time had been almost gentle, a comment about Maria's glow that somehow managed to sound more like pity than compliment. Tiffany had smiled when she said it, the kind of smile that made other people uncertain whether they'd heard an insult or a kindness. "Pregnancy suits you," she'd said, watching Maria refill water glasses at the corner booth. "Though I imagine it must be exhausting, working on your feet all day in your condition." The word condition had hung in the air like a question mark, and Maria had simply nodded, her professional smile intact. "Thank you, ma'am. Can I get you anything else?" That had been the test run, the trial balloon. When no one objected, when no manager appeared to defend their employee, when the world continued spinning without consequence. Tiffany had learned a valuable lesson. Maria was safe to target. The attacks had escalated with the predictable cruelty of someone who discovered they could inflict pain without cost. By the second week, Tiffany's daily visits had become a ritual of casual malice, each comment slightly sharper than the last. "You know, they make these special shoes for pregnant women," she'd said on a Tuesday, watching Maria's feet with exaggerated concern. "Though I suppose they're probably expensive on a waitress's salary. Maybe she should consider a desk job," one of her friends had added, something less physical. Oh, but then who would we have to entertain us? Tiffany had replied, and the laughter that followed had been cold enough to frost the windows. Sam had been there for that one too. 3 booths away with his coffee and his newspaper, watching Maria's face remain carefully neutral even as her hand pressed briefly against her lower back. He'd seen the moment of pain not from the cruel words, but from the 8-hour shift on swollen feet, the weight of carrying life while carrying trays, the bone-deep exhaustion that came from working 2 jobs to prepare for a future that felt increasingly uncertain. What struck him most was her silence. Not the silence of someone who couldn't speak, but the silence of someone who'd calculated the cost of speaking and found it too high. Maria's quiet wasn't submission, it was strategy, survival. The careful mathematics of a woman who understood that her dignity was worth less than her paycheck in the eyes of those who held power over her livelihood. Derek had tried to intervene. Once, his 19-year-old sense of justice finally overwhelming his fear of confrontation. It had been a Thursday, after Tiffany had made a particularly cruel joke about baby names. "You know you're not raising it in a mansion, right?" she'd said, loud enough for the entire section to hear. "Maybe stick to names that won't set unrealistic expectations." Derek had been clearing the neighboring table when the words hit him like a physical blow. He'd straightened, his face flushed with indignation, and taken 2 steps toward the corner booth before freezing. The weight of his student loans, his need for this job, his family's expectations, all of it had crashed down on him in that moment, and he'd stood there, paralyzed by the collision of his conscience and his circumstances. Maria had seen his struggle and had given him the smallest shake of her head, a gesture so subtle it might have been mistaken for a twitch. But Derek understood. She was protecting him from the consequences of defending her, shouldering the burden of his silence along with her own. He'd finished clearing the table and disappeared into the kitchen, where he'd stood against the wall for 5 minutes, his hands shaking with unused adrenaline and self-loathing. "I'm sorry," he'd told Maria later, as she helped him stack chairs at closing time. "I wanted to say something, but you need this job," she'd finished gently. "I know, honey, I know. It's not right though." "No," she'd agreed, rubbing her belly absently. "It's not right. But right doesn't pay the bills." Sam had overheard that conversation too, standing in the kitchen doorway with the night manager, discussing inventory. The casual acceptance in Maria's voice had hit him harder than any of Tiffany's barbs. Because it spoke to something larger than one woman's cruelty, it spoke to a system that ground people down slowly. That made dignity a luxury some couldn't afford. Janice had been less diplomatic in her response to the escalating harassment. On the Friday of the 2nd week, she'd marched over to the corner booth with the righteous fury of a woman who'd raised 3 children and buried 2 husbands. "You listen here," she'd said, her Louisiana accent thick with anger. "That girl is worth 10 of you, and if you can't see that, then you're blinder than a bat in sunlight." Tiffany had looked up from her phone with mild interest, as if Janice were a moderately entertaining television show. "Excuse me, you heard me? She's carrying a baby and working 2 jobs to make ends meet, and you're sitting here making jokes, like she's some kind of entertainment. That's not right, and you know it." "I think you're confused about who the customer is here," Tiffany had replied, her voice pleasant but edged with steel. "And I think your manager might be interested too. Know how his staff speaks to paying customers." The threat had been delivered with surgical precision. Janice had gone pale, understanding immediately that she'd overstepped a line she couldn't uncross. She'd glanced toward Maria, who was watching from the coffee station with an expression of quiet horror. "That's what I thought," Tiffany had continued. "Now, I think we're done here." Janice had retreated, but not before catching Maria's eye. The younger woman had approached the table with her usual professional grace, as if nothing had happened. "I'm sorry about that," she'd said quietly. Janice was just reminded about her place," Tiffany had interrupted. "And hopefully, so were you." Sam had watched the entire exchange from his booth, his coffee growing cold in his hands. He'd seen the moment when Maria's shoulders had curved slightly inward, when the weight of protecting not just herself but her coworkers had settled on her like a heavy coat. He'd seen her smile become a little more forced, a little more fragile, as if she were holding it together with nothing but will. That night, after the last customer had left and the chairs were stacked, Sam had lingered in the parking lot, watching Maria walk to her car. Her steps had been careful, measured, one hand always pressed to her lower back. Her ancient Honda had coughed to life on the 3rd try, and she'd sat in the driver's seat for a full minute before putting it in gear, her head tilted back against the headrest in a moment of exhaustion she thought no one could see. He'd followed her home not to intrude, but to understand. The apartment complex was one of those places where hope went to hide, where working families clustered together in buildings that had seen better decades. Her unit was on the ground floor, a small blessing for a woman in her condition, and through the thin walls, he could hear the murmur of a television, the sound of someone living alone. Sam had sat in his truck for another few minutes, thinking about the 20 years he'd spent building this place, about the hundreds of employees who'd trusted him with their livelihoods, about the woman inside that small apartment who was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders while serving coffee to people who saw her as less than human. The next morning, he'd return to his usual booth, ordered his usual breakfast, and resumed his watch. But something had shifted in him during those quiet moments in the parking lot. The passive observation was becoming something else, a gathering storm of purpose, a recognition that some silences were louder than screams. Maria had arrived for her shift 5 minutes early. As always, her uniform pressed and her smile ready. She'd greeted her coworkers with genuine warmth, checked on the elderly regular who always sat by the window, and prepared for another day of carrying dignity. Like a shield against the small cruelties that waited in the corner booth, Sam had watched her pour coffee for the businessman, deliver eggs to the construction workers, navigate the morning rush with the same grace she'd shown every day for months. And when Tiffany had walked through the door at her usual time, designer bag swinging from her shoulder like a weapon, Sam had set down his newspaper and prepared to witness whatever came next. The pattern was established now. The players were in position. The stage was set for the moment when silence would finally find its voice, when the weight of accumulated cruelty would demand its reckoning, and when the true measure of leadership would be tested not by the power to speak, but by the wisdom to know when speaking was no longer enough. On the present day, the words that finally shattered the silence were spoken on a Tuesday afternoon, cutting through the diner's warmth like winter wind. "You know what I don't understand?" Tiffany said, her voice pitched to Carrie. "How someone can be so careless with their life choices and then expect us to just pretend it's okay." Maria froze between tables, coffee pot trembling in her grip. "Getting pregnant when you can barely afford yourself? That's not brave, that's selfish. I'll have to watch you waddle around like some charity case." The silence that followed had weight, substance. Even the businessman stopped pretending not to listen. Maria's professional mask cracked just enough to show the raw hurt beneath. "That's enough." Sam Carter rose from his booth with deliberate.com/newspaper folded precisely. He walked to the corner table with the measured pace of a man who had made his decision. "Excuse me." Tiffany's triumph shifted to confusion. "I said that's enough." Sam stood beside Maria, his weathered presence somehow making the space feel smaller. "You're talking about one of the finest people I know, and who exactly are you?" Tiffany's voice sharpened, uncertainty creeping in. "I'm Samuel Carter. I own this place." The words fell like stones into still water. Tiffany's face cycled through disbelief, recognition, fear. "I've been sitting in this diner for 20 years, Sam continued, his voice filling the space without rising. "I've never seen anyone handle themselves with more grace than Maria. 8 months here, never late, never sick, never treated a customer with less than respect, even when it wasn't returned." Derek emerged from the kitchen with Janice, watching with growing amazement. Maria's spine straightened, tears bright in her eyes but dignity intact. "I've watched her endure 2 weeks of mockery. From you?" Sam said, never once responding with anything less than professionalism. "We were just," Tiffany began, pale now. "Just what?" "Having fun, making jokes about a pregnant woman working 2 jobs. He stepped closer, making designer clothes look tawdry. "I see someone who chooses to be better than the people who treat her badly. Someone raising a child with more character than you've shown in weeks." The restaurant had gone silent, every eye on the corner booth. "You treat my staff like entertainment. I've decided that's not the business I want to run." He straightened. "You're not welcome here anymore. Any of you. You can't, I can, and I am. This is my restaurant, my employees. You're not welcome." Tiffany's defeat was complete. Her assumed power, shattered by a man in worn denim, who'd been watching and waiting, stood shakily, friends already fleeing. "This isn't over." "Yes it is," Sam replied simply. When the door closed behind them, applause began quiet, then growing. Customers joined in, faces bright with satisfaction. Sam turned to Maria, tears streaming down her face. "Are you okay?" "I never thought anyone was really watching," she whispered. "You're not invisible, Maria. You're the best thing about this place." Derek approached, face bright with admiration. Janice smiled through her tears. "You're taking the rest of the day off," Sam said. "With pay. You're valued here, really valued." Maria looked around, seeing faces clearly for the first time. The businessman had tears in his eyes. Construction workers nodded approval. Everyone had witnessed her vindication. "Thank you for seeing me," she whispered. "Thank you for being worth seeing," Sam replied. "Now go home. Rest." As she gathered her things, the restaurant returned to normal rhythm. But something had changed. Everyone moved straighter, spoke kinder, saw each other more clearly. Sam returned to his booth, eyes not on headlines but on the empty corner table, somehow lighter now. Tomorrow someone else would sit there, watched and seen, held accountable for how they chose to treat those who served them. The revolution had been quiet, brief, complete. The golden afternoon sun painted Charleston's streets as Maria stepped out of Magnolia's diner. Everything felt different, lighter, as if weeks of accumulated weight had been lifted by more than words. Janice had hugged her goodbye with fierce protection. "You go on home now. Don't worry about nothing." Derek appeared as she gathered her things, face bright with newfound resolve. "If anything like that happens again, I won't freeze up, I promise." But Sam's parting words echoed strongest. "Your family here. Don't forget that." Family. The word carried the weight of belonging. of being seen not as a burden but as someone whose dignity was worth defending. Walking the familiar route home, Maria felt the city differently. Cobblestones that usually made her progress treacherous now offered solid support. Historic buildings that had felt like monuments to worlds she couldn't afford now seemed to acknowledge her passage. At the bus corner, she paused, hand resting on her belly as the baby shifted. For months she'd stood here feeling invisible. Today, she felt worth seeing. The bus arrived, but Maria chose to walk the longer route home. To process her vindication, to let the reality settle into her bones, past shop windows that had always mocked her with unaffordable displays, designer maternity clothes, glittering jewelry, expensive coffee. Today these symbols of economic distance felt different, still beyond her means, but no longer judgments on her worth. She thought about the baby growing inside her, about conversations they'd have regarding dignity and respect, about the difference between being poor and being worthless. Today taught her those weren't the same, that worth was something carried inside, something that couldn't be mocked away by people who confused wealth with value. Her apartment complex came into view, worn brick, patched parking lot, stark contrast. Two elegant neighborhoods she'd walked through, but today, it didn't feel like where dreams died. It felt like home. Climbing steps to her ground floor unit, she heard familiar sounds. Spanish soap opera on television, children laughing, families around dinner tables. These sounds, sometimes reminders of isolation, now felt like evidence of community, people making lives with whatever resources they had. Inside her small apartment, secondhand furniture, worn carpet, bare walls, except photographs, and a church calendar, the space felt like sanctuary. Maria settled into her modest armchair facing the window, hands on her belly, watching evening light fade over the city. She thought about Sam standing beside her, transforming her from target to someone worth defending, about applause that followed, faces witnessing her vindication, mostly about the baby she carried, the world she was bringing her child into, lessons about dignity and respect, and the difference between having money and having worth. She'd tell her daughter somehow she'd always known about the day someone stood up for her, not because she was powerless, but because she was powerful in ways that didn't announce themselves, about strength required to remain kind facing cruelty, courage needed to maintain dignity when others tried stripping it away. The phone rang. Carmen, her sister, checking in from San Antonio. How was work today? Different? Really different. Maria told the story, Tiffany's cruel words to Sam's quiet declaration of worth. Carmen listened with fierce attention of someone who'd also faced cruelty and emerged with dignity and tact. I'm proud of you, not for taking it, but for surviving it, for showing that baby what strength looks like. I didn't do anything, I just endured. That's not nothing. That's everything. Now that baby will grow up knowing her mama was worth standing up for, worth defending, worth seeing. After the call, Maria sat in gathering darkness, hands still on her belly. The baby moved, responding perhaps to emotional intensity, and Maria spoke softly to the life growing within her. Today you learned something important, she whispered. You learned that worth isn't measured by money or status or the opinions of people who think cruelty is entertainment. Worth is measured by how we treat each other when no one important is watching. She thought about Sam, sitting in his booth, day after day, watching and waiting for the moment when silence was no longer enough, about the courage it took to step forward, to use power not for personal gain but to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. That's what real strength looks like, she continued, her voice soft in the darkness. Not the power to hurt, but the power to heal. Not the ability to tear down, but the wisdom to build up. Outside her window, the city settled into evening rhythms. Lights came on in windows, families gathered around tables, the ordinary business of living continued, but something had shifted in the world today, some small balance corrected, some measure of justice served. Maria closed her eyes and thought about tomorrow, returning to work with her head high, serving customers with the same grace she'd always shown, but knowing now that grace was seen and valued. She thought about the corner booth, empty of cruelty, waiting for new occupants who would be watched and measured by the content of their character. The baby kicked, strong and sure, and Maria smiled in the darkness. Your mama's going to teach you about dignity, she whispered. About respect and kindness and the difference between having a voice and knowing when to use it. In the distance, church bells chimed the evening hour, their sound carrying across the city like a benediction. Maria sat in her small apartment, pregnant and powerful, poor and priceless, carrying within her both new life and renewed faith in the possibility that justice, however quietly it arrives, could still find its way to those who needed it most. The day was ending, but the story was just beginning, a story about worth and dignity, about the power of accumulated kindness, and about the quiet revolution that happens when someone finally says enough and means it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tables to serve, new opportunities to choose grace over bitterness. But tonight, Maria Lopez sat in her modest chair and knew with the certainty that comes from being truly seen. But she was exactly where she belonged, not because of what she owned, but because of who she was. And that, she thought, touching, Her belly one last time before rising to prepare for bed was worth everything. In a world where loud voices often get the spotlight, sometimes it's the quiet ones who teach us the biggest lessons. Dignity doesn't need to shout. And respect. It's not earned by power, it's revealed by how you treat those with none. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It tells the world kindness still matters. And subscribe if you believe the strongest people aren't always the loudest ones, because tomorrow's story might just restore your faith again.